The storytellers have long spoken of Sisyphus. Here is how they tell it. For the nights when you need this again, a subscription to Olympus Dreams brings it to you. Tonight we begin at the beginning. Long before the boulder, long before the hill, long before the endless turning of that great stone against the slope of Tartarus. We begin at the edge of the sea, on a rocky isthmus, where two bodies of water press close on either side, and where a young city rose from the pale limestone of the land. This is the story of the craftiest of men. This is the story of Sisyphus, and the tale reaches back further than most are willing to follow. They say his father was Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Not the Titan who turns the seasons, but the mortal king of Thessaly, who bore that storied name, descended from the divine line of the air. Aeolus was a man of practical mind and patient governance, and his wife Enarete was said to be gentle and clear-eyed. Together they raised many children, and among those children were sons of considerable ambition. It is worth noting, the storytellers say, that ambition in the house of Aeolus was not a quiet thing. It was loud and competitive, like the winds for which the family was named. It pushed outward in all directions. It found edges and tested them. Sisyphus was born to this house. The records do not agree on exactly when, for the old tales speak in seasons and reigns rather than counted years. But they agree on what he was from the beginning. He was clever. Uncommonly, unsettlingly clever. The kind of clever that other children noticed before adults did. The kind that made elders pause in the middle of a sentence when he asked a question they had not considered. His mind moved sideways and forward at once, finding gaps in reasoning the way water finds gaps in stone. He grew up in Thessaly, in the hills and wind-swept plains of his father's domain. He watched how kingdoms were managed, how men were persuaded, how a well-placed word in the right ear could change the course of an argument more efficiently than any raised voice. He learned that information was a currency older than bronze. He learned that the person who sees what others have missed holds a particular kind of power. The storytellers note that Sisyphus did not remain in his father's land. He was not made for inheritance. He was made for founding. And so, in the way of ambitious men in the age of heroes, he went looking for ground to call his own. He found it at the isthmus. The land there was extraordinary. It was a narrow strip of earth where the Saronic Gulf pressed in from one side and the Gulf of Corinth curved in from the other. To stand at the highest point of that limestone ridge was to see water on both horizons. Ships passed on either side. Trade winds moved through the passage. Everything that travelled between the eastern and western shores of Greece had to cross near this place or sail the long way around. To found a city here was to found a city at a crossing of the world. Sisyphus understood this immediately. He called the city Ephyra. Later the poets would know it as Corinth, but in those early years it was Ephyra, a name the locals already used for the place, and Sisyphus claimed it with the quiet certainty of a man who has measured the ground and found it worthy. He built on the rocky heights of the Acro-Corinth, that great flat-topped hill that rose above the plain. From its summit a king could see for remarkable distances. He could watch for ships, for armies, for weather, for opportunity. A city perched on such a hill was not comfortable, the storytellers acknowledge. The rock was hard, and the winds were constant. But comfort was not what Sisyphus was building toward. He was building toward control. In those early years, Ephyra was small. A settlement of walls and storehouses and market spaces, of craftsmen and traders who recognized the advantage of the location as readily as their king had. Sisyphus governed them with a kind of watchful attentiveness. He remembered names. He remembered what people owed and what they wanted. He was generous when generosity served him, and exacting when exactness was required. Word of him spread gradually through the Greek lands. The storytellers are careful about this point. They do not describe Sisyphus as a tyrant, not yet, not in these early days. They describe him as effective. They describe him as a man whose city prospered because its king could think 3 steps ahead of any situation. Merchants preferred dealing with him to dealing with other rulers because he was predictable in his cleverness. He would find his advantage, yes, but he would find it through negotiation and observation rather than through open violence. He did not take by force what he could obtain by wit. Homer, the oldest voice in this tradition, would one day call him simply this, the most cunning of men, not the strongest. Not the most pious, not the most beloved of the gods. The most cunning. That distinction would eventually cost him everything. But the price was not yet apparent in these founding years. The sea below the Acrocorinth sparkled in the changing light. The ships moved through the channel. The city grew slowly around its walls of pale stone. And Sisyphus watched it all from his high seat, cataloguing what he saw, weighing what it meant, considering what use might be made of it. The storytellers leave him here for a moment in this early scene, a king on his rocky hill between 2 seas. Sharp-eyed and deliberate, already the man he would be when the harder tests arrived. Already measuring the distance between what was and what could be arranged. They say the winds came through Ephyra in ways that reminded older residents of Aeolus himself, as though the father's gift had passed into the son in the form of an instinct for how things moved, how currents shifted, how the air changed before a storm. Whether that is poetry or truth, the old accounts do not say with certainty. They only say that Sisyphus stood at the edge of the Acrocorinth and looked out over his kingdom, and that even then, even in those quiet founding years, there was something in his gaze that was not quite at rest. Some small persistent turning of the mind toward the next thing, the next problem, the next arrangement to be made. The boulder had not yet appeared. The hill had not yet been named. The gods had not yet grown angry. All of that was still ahead, waiting in the long patience of fate, for now there was only Ephyra. The city on the stone, the king with the restless mind, and the sea steady and vast on either side. The house of Aeolus had many sons. This is something the storytellers are careful to preserve, because the story of Sisyphus cannot be fully understood without understanding the family that shaped him. Aeolus of Thessaly, mortal king though he was, fathered a line of children who carried ambition the way other families carried illness. It passed from parent to child without mercy and without dilution. Among those children was Salmoneus. The old accounts describe him as a man who wanted, above all things, to be mistaken for something greater than he was, not merely to be powerful, not merely to be feared. He wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to hear his name spoken the way men spoke the names of gods. He was Sisyphus's brother, born of the same father, raised in the same halls. And between them there grew, over years and across distance, a hatred that the storytellers describe as cold rather than hot, not the quick anger of men who quarrel. The slow, considered dislike of those who know each other too well and find what they know unforgivable. They say Salmoneus eventually settled in Elis. In the western Peloponnese, far from his brother's rocky isthmus, he founded his own city there. He named it Samonia after himself, which the storytellers note was an early sign of the particular quality of his vanity. A man who names his city after himself is a man who has already decided that history belongs to him, but a city was not enough for Salmoneus. What the old accounts tell next is difficult to render without a kind of quiet disbelief, even across all the centuries that separate the listener from the original telling. Salmoneus constructed bronze chariots, many of them. He drove them across a specially built bridge of bronze, so that the wheels clattered and rang against the metal surface, filling the air with a deep and rolling thunder. He dragged bronze vessels behind the chariots, heavy things that scraped and roared as they were pulled. And through this din, through this manufactured storm of noise and metal, Salmoneus rode and declared himself Zeus. Not a servant of Zeus, not a favoured child of Zeus. Zeus himself. He demanded that his people offer him the sacrifices owed to the god of the sky. He threw burning torches into the air and called them his lightning. He told those around him that the true Zeus was an imitation, that the god who held the thunderbolt was a copy of the original, and that the original stood here, on a bronze bridge in Elis, wrapped in the smell of hot metal and self-regard. The storytellers note this carefully. They do not present it as madness precisely. They present it as the far end of a quality that, in smaller measure, is simply ambition. The same impulse that builds cities and drives men to measure the distance between two seas. Taken too far, taken past the boundary where cleverness serves a purpose, it becomes something the Greeks had a word for, hubris. The overstepping. The reaching past the human toward the divine without permission or qualification. Zeus, the accounts agree, was not amused. But before Zeus acted, there was Sisyphus. The storytellers return to him now in Ephyra. He knew his brother. He had grown up beside this quality in Salmoneus, watched it sharpen and narrow over the years into something that was very nearly magnificent and very entirely dangerous. He felt no admiration for it. What he felt, the old accounts suggest, was something closer to contempt mixed with calculation. Because Sisyphus looked at his brother's behavior and saw two things simultaneously. He saw a fool performing thunder on a bronze bridge, and he saw an enemy who was accumulating enemies faster than he understood. The hatred between them was old and layered, and not easily described in terms of a single grievance. Some versions of the tale say it began over land. Others say it began over inheritance, over what Aeolus had promised and to whom. There are accounts that suggest a deeper rivalry, two men of the same line who could not occupy the same world without one becoming the measure against which the other was judged. Sisyphus had built through patience and observation. Salmoneus had built through proclamation and noise. Each found the other's method intolerable. Each was, in his own way, convinced that his approach was the correct one. They say that Sisyphus, watching from the Acrocorinth, received word of his brother's increasingly elaborate performances in Elis, the way a man receives news he has long anticipated. Without surprise, with a kind of quiet attention that was, in him, more dangerous than anger. He did not ride to Elis. He did not write letters of protest or send emissaries to reason with a man who had already decided he was a god. That was not how Sisyphus operated. The storytellers are consistent on this point. He waited. He considered. He turned the information over slowly, the way a merchant turns a coin to examine both faces, and he looked for what use might be made of it. What use he eventually found would come later. The oracle, Tyro. The dark calculation that grew out of this old hatred and took on a shape the storytellers describe only with careful distance. That is a story for another telling, the accounts suggest. For now, the conflict itself is what matters, the shape of it, the weight of it. Two brothers, both sons of Aeolus, both founders, both convinced that the world could be arranged according to their particular understanding of it. One driving bronze chariots through manufactured thunder and demanding the sacrifices of gods. One sitting on a limestone hill between two seas, watching the ships move through the channel below, storing what he knew and waiting, the wax-soft quality of ambition. The storytellers observe is that it does not announce its limits. It keeps softening, keeps warming in the heat of its own momentum, until it changes shape entirely. A man who begins by building a city ends by measuring himself against the sky, and a man who measures himself against the sky must eventually encounter something larger than himself that does not yield. Salmoneus's encounter came from above, in fire and legitimate thunder. Zeus struck him down. The accounts vary on the details of the city's fate. Some say it burned entirely. Some say only Salmoneus himself was taken. But in all versions, the man who drove his bronze chariots and called himself by the name of the god of storms was removed from the world with the particular finality that the gods reserved for those who collapsed the necessary distance between mortal and divine. The storytellers note that Sisyphus received this news in silence. What he thought, only the silence knows. The old accounts do not speculate. They only record that Ephyra continued, that the city on the stone persisted, and that its king remained on his high plateau overlooking the water and the passage of ships. The rivalry had ended. But the habits of mind that drove it had not, and the gods, who had noticed Salmoneus, had not yet noticed Sisyphus in the same way. Not yet, but they would. The sea moved on either side of the isthmus, indifferent and vast, and the winds that came through the channel carried no warning with them. Just the old familiar sound of air moving over water. The sound that had surrounded the house of Aeolus from the very beginning. The silence continued for some time after the news arrived. That is what the records suggest, at least. Not a grief-stricken silence, not the silence of mourning or regret. Something more considered than either of those. The silence of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open, and who, now that it has, is in no hurry to step through it immediately. Sisyphus had always operated on a longer schedule than other men. This is what the storytellers return to again and again when they try to account for what he became, not the cleverness alone. Cleverness was common enough among the sons of Aeolus. It was the patience behind the cleverness that made him singular. The ability to hold a thought for years without letting it show, to store a grievance or an intention the way a cellar stores wine, sealed away from light and air, deepening. The rivalry with Salmoneus was over. The old opponent had been removed. And yet something remained, something seeded years before in the particular quality of his hatred, in all those long observations from the high plateau. In the knowledge accumulated and set aside and never fully spent. There was the matter of Tyro. The accounts approach this part of the story with a careful deliberateness, as if the tellers themselves felt the shape of it required handling. Some versions soften what happened, wrapping it in the language of oracle and necessity. Others are more plain-spoken. But all of them agree on the essential fact. Sisyphus consulted an oracle. The oracle delivered a specific counsel. And Sisyphus, who had never once done anything without first measuring it against his own purposes, found in that counsel something that aligned with what he had already been considering. The oracle said, "They tell us that children born of a union between Sisyphus and his niece Tyro would one day avenge him against his brother. Let that sentence rest for a moment. Let its weight be felt. It is important, the storytellers note, to understand that Salmoneus was already dead by the time this counsel reached Sisyphus. Or it had recently arrived, and the dust of that city in the west had not yet settled. The details of exact timing are, in the way of very old accounts, imprecise. But the spirit of the thing is clear enough. The oracle was not offering Sisyphus a path to future revenge in some distant sense. It was offering him something more unsettling, a way to reach backward through his dead brother's legacy. Children who would carry forward the original grievance, a long arm extended past death. This is the moment in which Sisyphus reveals himself most clearly, not in the spectacular crimes that come later, not in the chaining of a god or the bargaining with a queen of the dead. Those come later. Those belong to a Sisyphus already in motion, already committed to a particular relationship with the world and its rules. This moment is earlier. This is the root of it. He was a man who, upon being told that a dark thing was possible, asked himself not whether it was permissible, but whether it was useful. Tyro was the daughter of Salmoneus. She was, by all accounts the storytellers give us, a young woman of considerable beauty and a considerable measure of her own suffering. She had not chosen her father's bombast. She had not manufactured his thunder or demanded his sacrifices. She had lived inside the story of Salmoneus, the way all children live inside the stories their fathers make, without being asked, without being able to refuse. What she knew of her uncle Sisyphus is not recorded. The accounts do not give her a perspective from which to understand what was happening until it had already happened. This too is part of what makes the tale difficult to carry gently. The storytellers tend not to linger here, and there is something in that restraint that tells its own story. Sisyphus acted. The oracle had offered him a direction, and his own older hatred had offered him a motive, and the combination of these two things, in a mind like his, was enough. He arranged what the accounts describe without elaboration. The children were born. Their names are given variously in different versions of the tale. They appear in some genealogies, are absent from others. But their purpose, according to the oracle, was fixed. Avengers of a grievance older than they were, carrying in their blood the unresolved argument between two brothers of the house of Aeolus. They say that Tyro, when she understood what had been done to her and for what purpose, killed the children herself. The accounts state this plainly and then move on, as if the weight of it does not require additional language. As if the fact, stated once, is sufficient to mark what kind of man Sisyphus was, not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. Cruelty in the ordinary sense is impulsive. What Sisyphus had done was deliberate, architectural, arranged in advance with the particular care he brought to everything. He had used a young woman and a prophesied purpose and a dead rivalry as materials. He had built something out of them. And what Tyro built in response was its own kind of answer. The storytellers observe that Sisyphus did not speak publicly about any of this. Ephyra continued as it had. The plateau stood above the water. The ships still moved through the channel below, their sails white against the blue of the gulf. Life on the Acrocorinth, from the outside, looked much as it had always looked. But something had shifted in the invisible accounting of the world. The oracle had been consulted. The dark instruction had been followed, and whether or not the children had lived to fulfill their purpose, the act of reaching for that purpose had revealed a particular quality in the man who reached. A willingness to go past the boundary of ordinary transgression without flinching, a preference for the longer, more calculated path, even when that path passed through territory that other men would not enter. The gods, the storytellers remind us, were not yet watching Sisyphus with the particular attention they would later bring to him. That attention would come through a different channel entirely, a river god's grief beside a wide, dark river, a nymph taken against the turning of the sky, a secret exchanged for fresh water on a limestone hill. Those were not yet happened. The water at Perein had not yet been promised to anyone. The abduction in the valley had not yet taken place. Asopus had not yet stood on any river bank with his terrible question. That was still ahead, for now, on the Acrocorinth, the king of Ephyra sat with what he had done. Not with regret, the accounts do not give him regret, with the quality of attention he brought to everything. The turning of it over, the measurement of it against what he had intended and what had actually resulted. The quiet arithmetic of a man who never stopped calculating, even when the numbers did not come out as he had planned. The wind came through the channel from the west, from the direction of Elis, from the direction of a city that had burned or had its king removed, or both, depending on which version of the tale one trusted. It carried the same sound it had always carried, air moving over water. The oldest sound that surrounded the house of Aeolus. The wind moved through the channel, and Sisyphus listened to it. He was not a man given to long silences in the way that other men were given to them. Other men fell silent from exhaustion, or grief, or the kind of vacancy that comes when thought has nowhere further to travel. His silences were different. They had the quality of held breath, of waiting for a number to resolve. He sat above the gulf, and the wind came through from the west, and he listened to it as a man might listen to a messenger who had not yet arrived. It was some time after this that he went down from the Acrocorinth. The accounts do not say what drew him specifically. Some tellings place the event in the valley to the south, where the land flattened between the hills and the air in the afternoons lay heavy with the smell of grass and river water. Others set it on the open road, at a point where the sky is wide and the ground is low, and the light strikes everything with particular clarity. The versions differ. What they agree on is what he saw. He saw Zeus. The storytellers understand that this statement requires a particular care. The gods did not always announce themselves. They did not always come crowned in lightning or attended by their signs. On this occasion, as on many occasions the myths record, the seeing was more complicated. It was a knowing rather than a sighting, a recognition. The air around certain divine acts carries a weight that the observant mind registers before the eye fully registers the shape. Sisyphus was, above all things, observant. What he saw, or understood that he was seeing, was the abduction of Aegina. A young woman, daughter of the river god Asopus, carried away across the landscape toward the water, toward the island that would later bear her name. The accounts describe her variously. Beautiful, as is required of the figures Zeus found interesting. Not a mortal woman, not precisely, but the daughter of one of those ancient river powers who occupied the middle ground between the elemental forces and the proper gods. A being of water and locality, named for the place, or the place named for her, depending on which way the genealogies ran. Zeus departed with her as such things departed in the old stories. Quickly, and with the absolute assurance of something that expected no resistance, Sisyphus watched. He did not call out. He did not move toward the scene or away from it. He stood in the particular stillness that he had cultivated all his life, the stillness that was not passivity but concentration, and he held what he had seen inside the careful architecture of his mind. He turned it over. He measured it. He asked himself not what it meant in the abstract, but what, precisely, it was worth. This is the moment the storytellers return to most often when they consider the question of what made Sisyphus what he was, not the oracle. Not the rivalry with Salmoneus, not even the act concerning Tyro, which revealed the shape of his will. This moment. A divine secret witnessed by accident, or perhaps by something closer to fate. Held in the hands of a man who had already demonstrated that he would use what came to him without asking whether he should. He knew that Asopus would be searching. A river god whose daughter had been taken does not lie quietly in his banks. The waters of Asopus, the ancient accounts tell us, ran dark with his grief. He moved through the land asking questions at every threshold, at every spring, at every stone that might have witnessed something. He had visited other places before he reached the isthmus. He had asked other figures who knew nothing, or who knew something and said nothing, for the gods kept their own counsel and the wise among mortals kept it with them. Asopus came at last to the region below the Acrocorinth. The storytellers say that Sisyphus approached him there, beside the water. They say it deliberately, with the weight of something that has been said many times before and will be said many times again. Sisyphus went to meet the grief of a father at the edge of his own territory, carrying what he had seen like a coin already warmed in the palm. The bargain was not complicated in its structure. Sisyphus had knowledge. Asopus had the power of running water, the ancient capacity of rivers to make springs emerge from limestone, to coax a source into being where before there had been only dry rock. The Acrocorinth was many things, but it was high and it was often dry, and the carrying of water up to the plateau was work that fell to the shoulders of others. A spring on the hill itself would change the nature of life there in ways that any king could measure. Sisyphus offered what he knew. In return, Asopus would give the hillside a spring. Perine. They say the water emerged from the limestone with the particular clarity that fresh water has when it comes up cold from deep inside the rock. Pale and clean and carrying the faint mineral taste of its origin, it would run for centuries, that spring. It would still be running when the city had changed its name and changed its masters and changed its gods and changed again. Travellers would drink from it. Poets would name it. It would become one of those fixed points in the story of the place, a thing that simply was, permanent in the way that only certain kinds of permanence are. But the water was the smaller part of what the exchange produced. When Sisyphus told Asopus where his daughter had been taken, and by whom he had done something that no mortal who understood his situation fully would have done, he had brought himself to the particular attention of Zeus. Not in the way that a hero might attract divine attention through some feat of war or piety, not with an altar or an oath, or any of the ordinary channels through which mortals and gods communicated. He had placed himself in the path of the most powerful force in the cosmos, and had, by the quiet act of speaking a name and pointing a direction, demonstrated that he regarded the secret doings of the divine as usable material. The gods, the accounts remind us, hold their secrets with considerable feeling. Zeus would not have been unaware of what had been traded. The divine perception, in the old tellings, operated differently from the human. It was not limited by distance or angle. It knew what concerned it. And what had just occurred beside the spring on the Acro-Corinthian rock concerned Zeus very directly. Some versions of the tale suggest that time passed before the consequence arrived. That Sisyphus returned to the plateau, and the spring ran clear, and the ships continued their passage through the channel below, and the city of Ephyra continued its ordinary business for a season, or for several seasons. Other versions suggest the response was swifter. As with many such details, the tellings differ, and the teller chooses. What does not differ is the quality of what Sisyphus carried back up the hill with him that day. He had come into possession of a spring. He had also, though he would not have named it this way, come into the range of a punishment that had not yet been prepared for him. The two things arrived together in the invisible accounting of the world. The water ran from the rock. The debt ran the other direction, into a future still assembling itself. The wax, a later teller might say, had begun to soften in the heat. Sisyphus walked up the limestone path toward the plateau. The wind still moved through the channel from the direction of Elis, carrying the sound of air over water. Below him, the ships held their course between the two blue arms of the sea. He did not look back at the place where the river god had stood. The plateau received him, as it always did, with indifference. With the particular flatness of stone that has known many footsteps and distinguished between none of them, Sisyphus crossed from the path onto the levelled rock of the upper citadel. The wind reached him there with more force than it had below. It came from the direction of Elis, as it had come for every day of his life on this hill. It moved across the channel, gathered speed above the open water, and broke against the face of the Acrocorinth like something that had travelled a long way looking for resistance. He had grown accustomed to that particular kind of wind. The accounts that survive this period of Sisyphus's reign present him as a figure already settled into the full weight of kingship. The city of Ephyra below the hill was not young. It had walls and a harbour, and the kind of organised commerce that requires not just intelligence at the top, but a trained patience distributed throughout. Ships were taxed, goods were assessed. The road through the isthmus passed beneath the oversight of those who answered to the plateau, and the revenues of that passage had over the years become the chief material foundation of what Sisyphus had built. He had built it carefully. The accounts do not describe a king who acquired power through inheritance and then maintained it through habit. They describe a king who regarded every element of the city as a problem to be solved. The harbour arrangement, the toll stations, the system by which disputes between merchants were adjudicated. These were not things that had assembled themselves. They had been arranged. And now there was water. The tale tells us that the change Perrine brought to the plateau was not immediate in its fullness. A spring requires time to become what it will be. The first days would have shown only the water itself, cold and clear, running from the new place in the limestone where the rock had been persuaded to yield. The basin had not yet been cut. The channel that would carry the overflow had not yet been directed. These were works of days and hands, and the particular slow satisfaction of stone shaped toward a use, but the water was there, running in the afternoon light, pale and cold and tasting of the deep rock it had come through. Sisyphus, the accounts suggest, was not a man given to sentiment about his own victories. He did not stand at the spring and feel the kind of gratitude that men feel when good fortune arrives from an unexpected direction. He had arranged this. He had seen the opportunity and moved toward it with the care of someone carrying something fragile across uneven ground. The water flowing from the rock was the anticipated result of a calculation made correctly. What occupied him now was a different kind of accounting. The household records of Ephyra do not survive. No tablet preserves the administrative details of his reign, but the broader tradition fills certain silences. It places beside him in this period the figure of Merope, one of the 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas and the sea nymph Pleione. One of the cluster of sisters the ancient sky-watchers named the Pleiades, and set among the stars as a group whose rising and setting marked the seasons of planting and harvest. Merope, the dimmest of the 7, some sources say, and the reason for her dimness was precisely this, that she had taken a mortal husband, that she had come down from the company of the immortal and bound herself to a life that would end. Her sisters shone from their high place. She was the one who looked away, the one who, in certain versions, hid her face. The match is recorded without extensive explanation. The tellings that touch on it give the impression of something already concluded, a context rather than a narrative. Merope was his wife. The city had a queen. The plateau was no longer only a place of strategy and taxation, but a household. What it was to be married to Sisyphus the tales do not dwell on. They note his character and his methods. They do not describe what he brought to a table set for 2, or how he slept, or whether he spoke easily of ordinary things. The ancient tradition was less interested in the interior of a man's house than in his deeds in the wider world. Merope remains at the edge of the account, present but not amplified. She is there. She will matter later, in ways that no one at this point in the tale has yet arranged. The kingdom, in any case, continued its business. Ships moved below the plateau. The wind moved through the channel from Elis. The spring ran cold from the limestone, and the basin being cut around it was filling with the accumulated patience of stonemasons who worked without needing to understand why they had been assigned to this particular task. They cut the stone. The water ran into the cut place. The work was the kind that outlasts the men who do it. Sisyphus watched what had been built with the attention of a man who was not finished building it. There are accounts that speak to the reputation he held among other men of power in this period. The merchants who passed through the isthmus spoke of him with a particular kind of wariness that is reserved for people whose intelligence is visible. They paid the toll, and they did not argue about it, and they moved on. The word that recurs in the older texts is cunning, or the Greek that was later rendered as cunning in the way that a tool is described as sharp. It was not a word meant to flatter. It was a word meant to describe something that had been observed and that the observer found important to note. He was, by all accounts, not an easy man to deceive. This is the quality that makes what came next so particularly shaped for this story. The accounts do not say that Sisyphus failed to understand the position he had placed himself in. The accounts do not describe a man who traded divine knowledge for a spring and then forgot what he had traded, or who underestimated the weight of what he had set in motion. The tradition is consistent on this point. He knew. He had calculated the worth of the spring against the cost of the secret, and he had judged the spring to be sufficient payment for the risk. Whether he judged correctly is the question the tale will spend many more chapters answering. For now, the afternoon light lay across the plateau in its heavy and hurried way. The channel below reflected a sky that was still fully blue. Merope was somewhere in the household. The spring ran in its new basin at the edge of the citadel, and somewhere in the accounting that kept itself without anyone's assistance. The debt that had arrived alongside the water was growing at its own pace, accumulating in the way of things that had been set moving and require no further attention from the one who set them. The wind pressed against the rock from the direction of Elis. The ships below held their course. Perraine ran cold and clear, and would run cold and clear long after the man who bargained for it had left every ledger on which his name appeared. The debt matured on an afternoon like any other. No thunder announced it. No displacement of air that was different in quality from the ordinary wind pressing up from Elis. The stonemasons were working at the basin's edge. The spring ran. The ships below moved in their slow arcs across the channel, indifferent to whatever was being arranged on the plateau above them. The figure that came was not what the tales expected their listeners to expect, Thanatos. As the older sources describe him, wore the appearance of a young man, not a warrior, not a herald with a visible office, a young man of unremarkable presentation, moving without the particular hesitation that marks a person unfamiliar with ground they are walking for the first time. He moved as one who had arrived at a great many places and found each of them already prepared for his presence. He carried no weapon that the accounts record. He did not need one. His authority was of a different order than iron or bronze. He came, the tellings agree, for Sisyphus. This was the settlement of the account. The spring had run long enough. The knowledge traded on the hillside above Sisyphus's banks had been weighed by those whose scales are not visible to mortal eyes, and the weight had been found sufficient to warrant collection. The debt, which had been accumulating in that unseen ledger since the day Asopus received his answer, had reached the point at which something arrives to collect. What the accounts describe next is not a scene of submission. Sisyphus saw what had come. This much the tradition insists upon. He was not a man who misread the nature of visitors, and Thanatos did not present himself in a form that a king of Sisyphus's particular intelligence would fail to identify correctly. He recognized what had crossed the plateau toward him. He recognized the errand it had come to complete. The tradition says he had prepared. This is the point at which the tellings diverge somewhat in their specifics, but agree in their shape. Some accounts describe a set of chains already in position. Others speak of a locked room, a clever mechanism, a hospitality extended in the formal ancient manner that carried with it obligations the guest was required to observe. The details shift between versions, as details do when a story has been carried for a very long time across a great many mouths, but the outcome in all versions is the same. Sisyphus, son of Aeolus, the man whom merchants named with that particular wariness reserved for visible intelligence, did what no mortal had done before. He took hold of Thanatos. He bound him. The accounts do not dwell on the mechanics of this, and there is perhaps wisdom in that restraint. The precise manner in which a mortal king lays hands on the god of death and renders him unable to complete his errand is the kind of detail that collapses under close examination. What the story requires is not the how, which varies, but the what, which does not. Thanatos was chained. He was held. He was, in some sense, a prisoner of the man he had come to collect. And with that, the world changed in a way it had never changed before. The older accounts describe this period with a kind of clinical precision that carries its own quiet strangeness. Old men lay in their beds and did not pass. Soldiers on distant fields took wounds that should have carried them away, and found themselves still breathing in the morning, still breathing the morning after that. Still there and still in pain, but unable to go where the pain should have taken them. Animals brought to sacrifice bled, but did not die. The knife accomplished what the knife accomplishes, and the blood ran, and nothing followed it. The natural conclusion of things had been suspended. Not reversed, not undone. Simply prevented from completing itself, the way a sentence might be interrupted mid-clause and left without its ending. The world waited. On the Acrocorinth the spring ran. The stonemasons continued their work on the basin. because the work was there and they had been assigned to it, and a man does not stop cutting stone because the atmosphere has taken on an unusual quality he cannot name. The wind came from Elis as it came every afternoon. The ships below moved in their measured courses across the channel. Sisyphus did not appear, in the accounts that survive, to be a man in a state of alarm. The picture the tradition preserves is of a king who had made a calculation and was observing the results of that calculation with attention but without panic. He had traded divine knowledge for a spring. He had received a visit in payment. He had responded to that visit with the instrument he had prepared. The sequence was logical. Each step had followed from the previous step in the way of things arranged in advance. The quality of that logic was the question the world was now living inside. There is a phrase in the older commentaries that speaks to what Sisyphus understood in this period. It says, in the rendering that has survived the centuries, that he knew the fire he carried. It is a phrase of the kind that the ancient storytellers used when they wished to indicate that a person had reached too close to an element they had correctly identified but incorrectly measured. Wax softens at a temperature that can be known in advance. The knowing does not always alter the outcome. He had bound Thanatos, and Thanatos was bound, and for a time that was sufficient. The king of Ephyra walked the plateau of his city, and watched his spring run, and his ships move, and his kingdom function with the precision of a mechanism that has been tuned with care. The debt had come to collect, and he had answered it by placing the collector in chains, and the world continued. But the world continued wrongly. The silence that settled over distant battlefields was not a silence of peace. It was the silence of something interrupted. Men who had expected to be released from their wounds found themselves confined to them instead. The rites that mortal communities performed for their dead could not be performed, because the dead were not arriving. The cycle by which the living became the shaded and the shaded moved on had been stopped at its first turning, and everything that depended on that turning was now suspended in a kind of amber. The gods noted this. The accounts are careful about what they say of the gods' awareness. But the consensus across the older tellings is plain. What Sisyphus had done was visible. The removal of Thanatos from his function was not a private matter between a mortal king and a minor deity. It was a structural disruption. It was felt in the way that an absence is felt, not as a presence but as a gap where a presence should be. On the Acrocorinth, the spring continued its cold work through the cut limestone. The overflow channel was not yet finished. The water found its way regardless, moving in the small determined paths that water finds when it has no prepared course to follow. The stonemasons, who understood nothing of what they had been placed beside, worked on. Among the gods who noted the disruption, one noticed it differently from the rest. Ares was not a god given to subtlety. He was not a god who felt the absence of a function and meditated on its implications. He was a god who stood on battlefields and found them changed, and who responded to that change with the directness of a thrown spear. The tales say he walked among the armies and found them wrong. Not wrong in the way of poor tactics or flagging morale, but wrong in a way that had no military term to describe it. Men lay in the dust of fields where they had fallen, and they did not go. They remained. The light did not leave their eyes in the way that light was supposed to leave eyes. Wounds that should have been final were instead merely ongoing, and the men who carried them could not be replaced on the field, could not be honoured in the rites that armies perform when a soldier passes, because the passing was not completing itself. The accounts say Ares found this intolerable. Not from mercy. The traditions are careful to record that his feeling was not mercy. He did not object to the suffering of the fallen. What he objected to was the disorder. War, in his understanding, had a grammar, it had a structure. The living fought, the wounded fell, and those who fell passed on to make room for the next engagement, the next calculation of force against force. Death was not the enemy of war. Death was its mechanism. Without that mechanism, war had become something it was not supposed to be, something without resolution, something that accumulated without releasing. Armies full of the unable to die pressing against armies equally unable to lose their fallen, the count of the wounded growing without ever clearing, battles that could not conclude because conclusion required what Sisyphus had locked in a room in Ephyra. The god of war, the tellings agree, did not deliberate for long. He came to the Acrocorinth as the afternoon moved toward its later hours. Not in the manner of a visiting dignitary, and not in the manner of Thanatos, who had arrived with the practised calm of one accustomed to being expected. Ares came as a force that expected to be accommodated, which is a different quality entirely, the stonemasons at the basin's edge. If they looked up, would have seen a figure whose bearing admitted no uncertainty about its own authority. Whether they looked up, the tradition does not say. The spring ran. The chisel continued its careful removal of stone from stone. There are several versions of what passed between Ares and Sisyphus at this point, and the tellings vary more here than at almost any other moment in the account. Some say Ares simply took what he came for by force, with no exchange of words. Others describe a brief, unequal negotiation that was never truly a negotiation, where the king of Ephyra spoke and the god of war declined to listen. One older fragment suggests Sisyphus tried to reason with him to articulate the logic of what he had arranged, and that Ares listened to the argument with the patience of someone waiting for a sound to stop. What all versions agree on is the result. Thanatos was freed from whatever had held him, and the moment he was free, his function resumed. The older accounts describe this moment with a restraint that is almost respectful. They do not catalogue the consequences in reverse, the way they catalogued the initial disruption. They do not tell us that somewhere a soldier finally closed his eyes, or that a wound accomplished its ending, or that an old man in a room somewhere found at last the exit he had been unable to find. These details are left to the imagination of the listener, who has lived in the world long enough to know what the resumption of natural function would mean, having been told what its absence had produced. The world, briefly, settled back into itself, and then Ares turned to Sisyphus, and the question of what the king of Ephyra had earned for himself became no longer a question. The tradition is not unkind to Sisyphus in this moment. There is no record of him attempting to flee. The picture the accounts preserve is not of a man who had miscalculated and was now in panic. It is of a man who had calculated correctly in all particulars except one, and who understood, with the same intelligence that had built the trap, exactly what the final accounting looked like. He had bought time. The records suggest he had always understood it as time, not as escape. And yet, the mind that had recognized Thanatos at the gate, that had prepared the room and the chains, that had understood the leverage of a secret divulged and the value of a spring on a plateau above two seas, that mind did not stop simply because Ares was standing in his city. The spring ran at the basin's edge, the overflow channel still unfinished. The afternoon light came down from its unchanging angle. Sisyphus stood, the accounts agree, in the manner of a man who was not finished with his calculations. The older commentaries note, with the slight dry precision that is the mark of those tellings, that this was the quality of him that the gods found most difficult to account for. It was not his defiance exactly. Defiance was known. It was the particular variety of his attention, which did not diminish in proportion to the circumstances. A man standing at the edge of his final accounting and still, visibly, thinking. There was no spring that could be bargained for this time. No room prepared, no chain whose existence had been considered in advance. But the thinking continued, and the tale knows it, and what the tale knows it tends to keep for the chapters still ahead. The gods can move a man from one place to another. The traditions affirm this without difficulty. Moving a mind from one position to another is a different kind of work, and the god of war, for all his directness, was not equipped for that particular labour. Ares delivered Sisyphus to the underworld, as the accounts say he did. The spring on the Acrocorinth ran on, cold through its cut limestone, the overflow finding its own path. The stonemasons packed their tools as the light moved toward its daily ending. The ships below continued their slow arcs across the water. None of these things waited for him. None of these things knew that waiting was what was being asked of them. The descent, say the accounts, was not what a living man would expect a descent to be. There was no great chasm that opened, no theatrical swallowing of light. The tradition preserves the crossing to the underworld with the same measured quality it preserves everything about Sisyphus as a thing that happened, proceeding by ordinary steps from ordinary causes, arriving at a place that was extraordinary only in its permanence. Ares did not accompany him far. That work was not the god of wars to complete. His portion was the delivery, not the journey, and the accounts suggest he understood his portion precisely and performed it without remainder. What received Sisyphus at the threshold was not violence, but process. The river Styx moved as rivers move, which is to say, it moved slowly and with direction. Its water was dark, not black, and the accounts that trouble themselves with such details note that the darkness came not from depth, but from the particular quality of absence that accumulated there. The way a room grows dim when the last lamp is carried out, and the darkness that follows is not a new thing, but simply what was always present beneath the light. The ferryman Charon stood at his post. He is mentioned in the accounts without elaboration. He was part of the machinery of that place, and like the machinery of Ephyra's spring, he ran whether or not the men who had built the conditions for his work were standing by to observe. Sisyphus. The tradition notes, crossed. It says this without drama. He crossed. The boat moved. The dark water passed beneath. On one bank was the world where limestone was cut, and ships moved under morning light, and a spring ran through channels unfinished by the men who had begun them. On the other bank was the place where none of that had meaning in the way it had meaning before. The accounts differ on whether Sisyphus spoke during the crossing. Some preserve a silence. Others suggest he questioned Charon about the arrangement of the place, not from distress, but from the same disposition that had led him to assess Thanatos at the gate before the door was closed. The ferryman, in these versions, gave no answer that repaid the asking. Charon was not a figure who conversed. He was a figure who transported, and those two things belong to different categories of attention. On the far bank, the dead moved in their customary manner, which is to say, they moved as if movement were a habit they had not yet understood they could abandon. The newly arrived shade of Sisyphus stood among them. The accounts that describe this moment tend to pause here, as if the image itself requires a certain consideration before the telling can proceed. The king of Ephyra, builder of a city between two seas, the man who had bargained with the river god for a spring, and lured the god of death into a prepared room. Standing now where all accounts of cleverness eventually ran out, he looked, the tradition says, as a man looks when he is taking stock of new surroundings. Not with despair, not with awe. With the particular quality of attention that had already been noted at the plateau above Corinth, the attention that did not diminish in proportion to circumstances, he observed the asphodel meadows, where the shades of the ordinary dead walked in the mild dimness of that place. They moved without urgency. They spoke, some of them, in the low registers of people recalling things that no longer pressed upon them. They were neither happy nor unhappy, in the way a stone in a field is neither happy nor unhappy. They simply persisted, which was the nature of that region. He observed the rivers, whose names the geographers of the underworld had catalogued with the precision of men who had not visited but had listened carefully. Styx behind him. Lethe ahead, with its particular property of forgetting. Acheron, the river of woe, which moved with a heaviness that the living Corinthian air had never possessed. Phlegethon, whose current ran with a warmth that was not comfort, but something adjacent to it. He observed the direction of the deeper regions, where the sound that the accounts describe as a particular quality of silence indicated the presence of Tartarus, and where. In the contrary direction the air moved differently, carrying a quality that those with older knowledge recognized as the boundary of Elysium. He had been to none of these places. He had no predecessor to consult, but his disposition, the accounts suggest, was not that of a man encountering the unfamiliar so much as a man engaging with a new set of materials and taking their measure before determining what could be made of them. This quality troubled the older shades, or so some tellings suggest. The dead of the asphodel meadows had settled into their dimness. They had released, as the place required, the urgency of living. Sisyphus carried his urgency with him, the way a man carries warmth in winter without intending it and without being able to put it down. He was escorted. In the accounts that describe this process, toward the hall where Hades and Persephone held their court. The escorts are not named. They are part of the infrastructure of that place, as Charon was part of its infrastructure. Serving their function as the overflow channel of the spring at Acrocorinth served its function, directing what came toward it according to the contours of the arrangement. The hall of Hades and Persephone was not described by those who later told the tale in terms of grandeur or menace. It was described in terms of authority, which is a quieter quality. The throne was there, the king of the dead was there, the queen of the dead was there, and Sisyphus, king of Ephyra, son of Aeolus. The most cunning of mortals, as the later poets would call him, stood before them as a new arrival stands before those in whose domain he has come to rest. The accounts note that Persephone observed him with a quality of attention that was not unfamiliar to her. She had received many shades. She had received heroes and kings, clever men and brave men, men who had defied the gods in one fashion or another. She had some experience of the varieties of mortal distinction. What she observed in Sisyphus, the tradition preserves with the care it takes with details that matter, was a man who was already, visibly composing what he intended to say, not a man defeated, not a man resigned to the dim persistence of the meadows. A man who had arrived in a new place and was taking its measure with the same disposition he had carried at every prior accounting, and who had already, by the evidence of his bearing, begun to calculate what the materials of this particular room might be made to yield. The river ran above, in the world of limestone and afternoon light and unfinished channels. Merope moved in the palace of Ephyra. The ships continued their arcs across the water between the two seas, indifferent to the absence of their king, as the world is indifferent to most absences, carrying on with its own uninterrupted business. In the hall of Hades, Sisyphus waited. Persephone waited. The conversation had not yet begun. When Sisyphus spoke, the tradition says, he did not begin with a complaint. He began with a fact. "My wife," he said, "has left me unburied." The words were offered without performance, without the trembling that lesser men might have allowed to enter their voice in that hall, before that throne, under that particular quality of authority that the room carried. He stated the fact as a surveyor states a measurement, as a builder reports what the ground will and will not support. Persephone heard him. The accounts are careful to say that she heard him fully, not in the way of one waiting for a pause in which to respond, but in the way of one who has learned, through long practice, to measure the weight behind words before attending to the words themselves. She had heard grief in that hall. She had heard rage. She had heard men plead and heroes argue, and kings who had forgotten that the throne behind them now belonged to someone else. She had heard every variety of mortal eloquence that the human voice could produce when stripped of the circumstances that usually sustained it. What she heard in Sisyphus, the tradition preserves, was something different. Not grief, not rage, not the trembling edges of a man undone by his new surroundings. What she heard was calculation wearing the clothing of grievance. Sisyphus continued. No funeral rites had been observed, he told her, no offerings at the tomb. no coin left for Charon, though the crossing had been managed regardless. His body lay unattended, without the observances that the gods themselves required of the living when one of their number passed from the upper air into this lower domain. The proper order had been violated. The rites existed for reasons. The Queen of the Dead would understand, better than anyone, why those reasons mattered. There was, the accounts note, something admirable in the architecture of this speech. It did not ask for sympathy. It appealed to principle, and the principles it named were genuine ones. The burial rites were not trivial customs. They were the architecture by which the living acknowledged the dead, the mechanism by which a shade arrived here with the proper weight of ceremony behind it. Persephone herself was guardian of that order. Sisyphus had found the precise point where his interest and her jurisdiction overlapped. He had not found it by accident. Hades, the tradition says, was silent during this. He was often silent. Authority of that particular kind does not require constant demonstration. He sat where he sat, and his presence occupied the room the way deep water occupies a basin, without announcing itself, without needing to. But it was Persephone who held the question before her, and the question, if it could be shaped into a single statement, was this: whether the observance of proper order was worth more than the caution that the man standing before her obviously warranted. The older tellings note that she considered him for a long moment. They note also that she had heard many pleas, but few that had been assembled with such quiet precision. And somewhere in that observation, the tradition suggests, lay the difficulty of her position. To refuse him on the grounds that he was too clever for the request to be genuine would be to refuse the principle he had correctly invoked. To grant him on the grounds that the principle was sound would be to release the one shade in that hall most likely to find a reason not to return. She was not deceived, the careful tellings insist. Let this be stated plainly as the accounts state it. Persephone was not a queen made queen by innocence. She had left one world for another against her will, and in doing so had come to understand both better than most who inhabited either. She saw what Sisyphus was doing. She saw the seam between the genuine grievance and the construction built around it. She granted it anyway. The reasons given in different versions of the telling vary. Some say she was moved by the principle itself, that to refuse on grounds of suspicion would set a worse precedent than to grant on grounds of the rule. Some say she calculated that the return of a mortal to the living world, even this mortal, was a matter the upper gods would resolve, and that her role was to administer her domain rather than conduct business on behalf of Olympus. Some say she found in his bearing something that reminded her of the quality of things that continue past, where continuation seems reasonable, the vine that grows through stone, the spring that runs uphill when the terrain demands it. There is a version, one of the quieter ones, that simply says she gave him what he asked for because what he asked for was technically within the bounds of what could be asked, and she was a queen who administered her domain according to its own principles, not according to the character of those who appealed to them. The terms were stated. He would return to the upper air. He would attend to the proper rites. He would correct the disorder his wife had permitted through neglect. And when that business was concluded, he would return. Sisyphus heard the terms. He inclined his head, the accounts say. It was the gesture of a man acknowledging an agreement, not the gesture of a man accepting a verdict. The distinction between those two things, in this particular hall, before this particular throne, was the fault line that later tellings would return to again and again. An agreement implies two parties withstanding. A verdict implies one authority and one subject. Sisyphus had spent his life arranging that the first of those structures governed every exchange he entered, even here. Even now, he was escorted back through the hall, past the mild dimness of the asphodel meadows, where the shades continued their unhurried movement among their recollections, past the rivers whose names he had catalogued on his arrival, toward the crossing, toward the upper air, toward the limestone and the afternoon light, and the unfinished spring channels, and the woman who had done exactly what he had told her to do, and who waited in the palace of Ephyra, not in neglect but in compliance, in the precise enactment of a plan laid before his departure. The stone fields of the asphodel region lay behind him. The world above waited, as it always waits, with its particular indifference to the arrangements made below it. What had been granted was real. What had been promised in exchange was also real, in the way that all promises are real at the moment of their making, and in the way that this particular promise, made by this particular man, in this particular room, was already being sorted from the obligations that would be honoured and those that would be managed as one manages every other obstacle, with patience, with attention, and with the application of whatever materials the situation provided. The hall receded behind him. The crossing lay ahead, and above the crossing, above the dark slow current of the Styx, above the terrain of that lower domain, the world continued in its brightness, waiting for him to come back to it. The crossing of the Styx was accomplished without ceremony. The ferryman Charon, who had conveyed him in the earlier direction, did not speak. He did not need to. The business of the crossing was a practical matter, and Charon had been conducting it since before the first mortal drew breath. He poled the dark vessel across the slow current with the patience of something that has never known hurry, and when the far bank came into view, grey and indistinct at first, then firmer, the vessel touched the stone and stopped. Sisyphus stepped out. Behind him the current continued. The accounts do not linger on the crossing itself. What interests the tradition is what came after it, the long passage upward through the borderlands between the lower world and the upper one. The region through which that passage ran was not fully dark and not fully lit. It was the quality of light one finds at the far end of a stone corridor when daylight is present somewhere ahead but has not yet arrived at the place where you stand. The ground underfoot was uneven. The air was still. He walked. The tellings agree on this, that he walked without being guided. The escort that had accompanied him from the throne hall did not continue past the crossing. The terms of Persephone's grant had placed him, at that point, in the position of a traveller who has been issued a passage and is expected to follow it to its stated end. Whether he would do so was not a question the borderlands could answer. The borderlands are indifferent to the business of those who move through them. They simply exist, as corridors exist, without opinion on what passes along them. The light grew by degrees. There is a detail preserved in certain of the older tellings, one not always included, that as the upper air drew near, Sisyphus paused. Only briefly. He stood in that corridor where the darkness was beginning to give way, and he remained still for a moment that the accounts do not measure. What he was doing in that pause, whether it was something like the gathering of a man about to emerge from a long enclosure, or something more deliberate, is not recorded. The accounts note the pause and do not interpret it. Then he continued. The air changed. The stillness of the lower regions gave way to the faint movement that belongs to the world of the living. A breath of it reached him first, and then more, carrying with it the particular quality of air that has passed over limestone and open water and the dried grass of late summer. The Acrocorinth was above him somewhere. The isthmus lay to each side. The sea was present in the air before it was visible, its salt and its coolness arriving ahead of any sight of the water itself. He came out into the light. The accounts use different words for this moment. Some say he emerged. Some say he returned. One of the older tellings uses a word that means more precisely to surface, the verb used for a swimmer breaking the water, and there is something in that choice that has stayed with the tradition. The world received him back, the way still water receives a stone drawn up through it, closing over the disturbance without comment. The light was very bright after the lower regions. He stood in it and let his eyes adjust. Ephyra lay below the height where he had emerged. He could see the outline of the city from where he stood, the pale stone of the walls, the descent of the hillside toward the narrow land between the two seas. He could see the spring. The spring pearine, which he had bargained for, which had been the price of a secret he had offered freely to the grieving Asopus. The water ran from the rock and fell through the cut channels he had ordered, and caught the morning light as running water does, in fragments and brief reflections that were gone before they could be fixed. He looked at it for a time, then he descended. The palace of Ephyra was as he had left it. The stones of the courtyard were warm. The fig tree against the eastern wall had dropped fruit on the paving below, and the wasps were at the fallen figs in the particular silence of creatures engaged entirely in their work. The smell of the palace was the smell he had known for all the years of his reign, salt and stone and the cool of the interior rooms where the sun did not reach. Merope was waiting. The accounts say she was in the inner courtyard. They say she rose when she heard him. They do not report what was said between them, and this absence is considered significant by those who study the tradition. The omission is not a gap in the record. It is, the careful readers suggest, the tradition's acknowledgment that what passed between these two was not the kind of speech that belongs in the public account of a legend. What had been done according to an arrangement made between them before his departure. She had carried out her part. He had carried out his. They stood in the courtyard, and the sun continued above them, and the fig tree dropped another piece of fruit in the silence. What the tradition does record is what he did not do. He did not begin the preparations for his return. Not immediately, and not in the days that followed, and not in the season that followed those days. The obligation he had acknowledged before the throne of Persephone did not cease to exist. It remained, as all obligations remain, present and unresolved in the structure of things. But Sisyphus had spent a life finding the space between the presence of an obligation and its enforcement, and he was adept at locating that space and moving within it. He attended to the proper rites for his burial. This much the tradition confirms. The coin was provided. The rites were observed. The disorder Merope had permitted by instruction was formally corrected. In this narrow sense, the first part of the agreement was honoured. The second part, the return, was placed, without announcement, into the category of things that would be addressed when addressed. The years passed. This is stated quietly in the accounts, almost in passing. The years passed. Sisyphus lived in his palace above the spring. He walked the length of the isthmus in the mornings. He watched the water run from the rock of Peirene and fall through the channels, and he watched the two seas lie on either side of the narrow land as they had always lain, indifferent and immense. He grew older. The lines of the city continued below him. The trade that had always moved through Ephyra continued to move. He was, in this second portion of his life, a man living out what had been taken from him, not with haste, not with the frantic energy of someone who knows the thing they hold is borrowed, with the careful, unhurried quality of a man who has decided that the terms of the loan are, like all terms, open to interpretation. The tellings vary on how long this second life lasted. The duration is not fixed in the tradition. What is fixed is that it ended, as all things end, and that when it ended, Sisyphus had lived it entirely and without apology. The spring Peirene ran on the morning of his last day there, as it had run on every other morning. The water fell through the cut stone channels. The light caught it in the same brief fragments. The wasps moved in the silence of the fallen figs beneath the fig tree in the courtyard. He lay down, the accounts say, and the world closed over him a second time. This second descent was not like the first. The first time, the accounts tell us, Sisyphus had been delivered. Ares had carried him, or compelled him, and Thanatos had been there, restored to his function, and the whole proceeding had the character of a thing done to a man. He had arrived in the lower world as an object moved from one place to another. The agency had not been his. The second time was different, and it is in this difference that the tradition locates whatever remains to be said about the character of Sisyphus. They say the gods grew tired before Sisyphus did. This is the way the telling goes. Olympus is not without patience. The gods hold time in a manner unlike any mortal reckoning, and what passes as years among the living is something closer to an afternoon in divine attention. But even Olympus has its limits of tolerance. The obligation had been spoken before Persephone herself. And what is spoken before Persephone does not dissolve simply because the one who spoke it finds it inconvenient to honor. The records are not precise about who first named the problem aloud. Some tellings suggest it was Hermes who brought it forward, having noted the discrepancy during the course of other business. Others suggest that Persephone herself eventually sent word upward through the various channels by which the lower world communicates with the upper. The particulars differ. What does not differ is the outcome. Hermes was dispatched. He is the right choice for such errands, and the tradition knows it. He is the god who moves between worlds without effort, who requires no crossing and no coin, who passes the borders of the living and the dead the way wind passes through an open door. He carries no weapon in the usual sense, though the caduceus is its own kind of authority. He does not threaten. He simply arrives, and his arrival means the matter is no longer open. It is said he came to Ephyra quietly. This is consistent with what the tradition records of Hermes generally. He does not announce himself. He does not appear in storm or fire. There is simply a moment when he is not present, and then a moment when he is. Sisyphus, the accounts suggest, recognized him. A man who has spent his life in calculation does not reach the end of such a life without knowing, at some level, where the limit of the calculation lies. Sisyphus had lived inside the extended space of his borrowed time with full awareness that it was borrowed. He had not deceived himself about this, even while he declined to act upon it. There is a kind of clarity available to very intelligent men at the end of their resources. The tradition suggests he had arrived at that clarity before Hermes reached him. There is no recorded exchange between them in most versions of the telling. This absence mirrors the earlier silence of the tradition around the reunion with Merope. The two silences are different in quality, but they are both deliberate. The reunion had been too private for the public record. This meeting had nothing left to say that had not already been said at length by action and by inaction across the whole of the years since the first descent. Some accounts offer a single phrase, something spoken by Sisyphus to Hermes, or to the air, or to no one in particular, a brief acknowledgement. The tradition preserves these fragments without certainty about their authenticity. One version has him say simply that it had been a fine spring. Another has him say nothing, but turn and look once more toward Perrine, where the water ran from the rock through the cut channels, as it had always run. The spring was running that day. The accounts agree, as it had run on every other day. The light was in the water briefly, in the manner the tradition has noted before. The fragments of reflection there and gone. The channels he had ordered cut from the rock, carrying the water he had bargained from Esopus, still performing their function without him. He left it running. The descent. This second one is described in terms the tradition finds difficult to fix precisely. There was no ferryman waiting on the shore of the living world. Hermes does not require a ferryman's assistance. The passage he manages is more direct than that, less beholden to the usual geography of dying. What the accounts do say is that the passing out of the upper world had the character of a door closing rather than a man falling, a quiet, conclusive sound. The world settling back into the shape it had before the interruption. The scholars who have considered the tradition carefully have sometimes noted that the second death of Sisyphus contains a quality that the first does not. The first death was a confrontation. There was Thanatos arriving with chains, and the chains being turned, and a struggle of will against authority. The second death has no such contest in it. It is the recognition, at last, that the thing which had been deferred cannot be deferred further. What is wax softened past a certain point does not regain its hardness when removed from the heat. It has changed. The form it held before cannot be recovered simply by willing it recovered. Sisyphus had spent his second life in the warmth of what he had won, and the warmth had done its work by degrees too gradual to measure, and at the end there was no more form to hold. He passed down through the regions in the manner of the dead, the border country. That corridor of stone and growing grey light received him the way such places receive what passes through them, without comment, without alteration of its own quality. The light at the far end was no brighter and no dimmer than it had been when he had last moved through it in the other direction. There is nothing in the tradition about what he observed on this second passage. The tradition is, here as elsewhere, economical. He had seen it before. There was nothing to report that had not already been reported, and the careful records do not repeat themselves for the sake of symmetry. What the tradition does say is that he arrived. The lower world received him a second time. The path from the border country to the deeper regions is not long, in the way that distances in the underworld are not long, being measured in something other than the steps a body takes. He had been this way before. He knew the character of the air, the quality of the dark, the sense of weight that the upper world disperses and the lower world retains. He arrived, and the judgment was waiting, and this time there was no plea prepared, and no throne he had not already stood before, and no trick left that the tradition had not already recorded and accounted for. Sisyphus stood in the lower world a second time. Behind him, in the upper world, the spring Pyrene ran on through its cut stone channels, carrying water from the rock to wherever water goes, and the fragments of light in the moving surface appeared and were gone before they could be named. The judgment hall of the lower world is described in the tradition with a consistency that suggests either a genuine account or a story so often told it calcified into a single shape. The versions agree on its essentials: a space of stone, a stillness of air that has never known wind, 3 figures seated at the far end, and Sisyphus standing before them for the second time. The 3 judges of the dead are named in the tradition: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus. 3 kings from the upper world who had governed with sufficient justice to earn this appointment, this final office, without appeal. They are not gods. The tradition is careful about this. They are men who became something else through the quality of their judgment, and it is in that transformed quality that they now sit and weigh the cases of the dead. Sisyphus had stood before at least one of them before. The first ascent had included a reckoning of some kind, though the tradition is less clear about its precise form, because what had followed, the plea to Persephone, the release, the long second life, had interrupted the proceedings before they could be completed. This time there was no interruption to anticipate. He knew that. The record of what was said in that hall is not preserved in any full form. What survives is the summary. The charge, as the tradition renders it, had 3 parts. The first was the betrayal of the divine secret. Zeus had taken Aegina from her father Sisyphus, and Sisyphus had watched from the wall of Ephyra, and Sisyphus had made a bargain. He had traded that knowledge for water. The spring ran on the Acrocorinth. It ran still, even now, in the world above, carrying the price of that betrayal through its channels. What the gods will not forgive, the tradition notes, is not the act alone, but the calculation behind it. He had known what he was doing. He had done it deliberately. The spring was the record of his deliberateness, written in stone and water. The second charge was the imprisonment of Thanatos. This required no elaboration in the telling. Death himself had arrived at Ephyra with his chains, and the chains had been turned, and the world had spent a season without the dead it was owed. Old men had sat with their suffering extended. Warriors had lain on fields unable to pass. The order of things had bent around the will of one man who found that will sufficient reason to bend it. The gods had found it sufficient reason to remember. The third was the deception of Persephone. He had stood before the queen of the underworld and spoken of unwashed rites and an unburied body and a wife who had failed her duties. He had spoken with the fluency of a man for whom truth and invention occupied the same territory. Persephone had believed him, or had found his case persuasive enough to act upon, and he had walked back into the sunlight and remained there until the sunlight itself had worn away at him. Slowly, by degrees, like water working on stone over years too many to count, the three judges considered these things. The tradition does not record deliberation. There is no suggestion of disagreement among them, no minority opinion, no version in which Rhadamanthus found extenuating circumstance where Minos found none. The cases that reach this hall in the myth are resolved cleanly. The guilt of Sisyphus was not a question the tradition ever presents as open. What was open was the sentence, and the sentence required something proportionate to the particular shape of the offence. The tradition is attentive to this proportionality. The punishments of Tartarus are not arbitrary in the way that a simple torment might be arbitrary. They carry the logic of correspondence. Tantalus had stolen from the gods and offered divine flesh to mortal mouths, and so he stood forever just short of what he needed, reaching and not arriving. Ixion had raised his hand against the divine order through pride and violation, and so the wheel carried him without destination, without pause, without the still point on which pride imagines itself resting. For Sisyphus, the sentence spoke to what he had most essentially been. He was the cleverest of men. The tradition says so plainly. The accounts that remember him call him this without qualification. His whole life had been organized around the principle that intelligence, applied with sufficient precision and patience, could circumvent what lesser minds accepted as fixed. He had circumvented a god. He had circumvented death. He had circumvented the queen of the dead. Each circumvention had worked for a time, in the manner that such things work before the thing circumvented found its way around the circumvention. The boulder and the hill were the answer, the tradition found to this, not because pushing a stone up a slope has anything obvious to do with cleverness. The correspondence is in the structure, not the surface. The boulder approaches the summit. The effort is real, the near arrival is real. And then the summit proves unreachable, not through any flaw in the effort, but because the thing has been arranged to be unreachable. The conclusion perpetually deferred, the resolution always almost present, the labour sustained precisely by the nearness of what it cannot reach. This was what Sisyphus had built his life to be, a series of almost arrivals. The spring almost obtained by legitimate means, so he obtained it by other means. The death almost accepted, so he inverted it. The return to the lower world almost honoured, so he deferred it. The almost was always the invitation and the engine. Now the almost would continue, and nothing would ever follow it. The sentence was given. The accounts agree on this without providing the exact words, which is characteristic of the tradition in its most formal passages. The words matter less than the arrangement. Sisyphus was assigned his work. The region where this work takes place is described briefly. A slope of Tartarus, steeper than a natural hillside has any cause to be. The stone already present when he arrived, as if it had always been waiting there among the shadows, which the tradition suggests it had. The slope ascending into a darkness that is not the darkness of height or distance, but the darkness of the principle it embodies. He was taken to the place. There is a moment, unnamed in most accounts, that occurs between the pronouncing of a sentence and the beginning of its execution. The tradition sometimes leaves this moment blank, sometimes it notes the quality of the silence. Here the silence had the character of completion, not of ending, because nothing in this place ends, but of the final piece arriving into position. The pattern of his life, laid out from Ephyra and the spring, and the brother he had despised, and the god whose secret he had sold, now resolved into this, the slope. Stone. What Sisyphus thought at that moment the tradition does not say. The tradition has been careful throughout to record actions and some words, but to leave the interior largely unstated, as befits a figure whose most dangerous faculty was his mind. To report his thoughts would be to grant him another kind of agency, another kind of reach. The tradition declines. What the tradition offers instead is the stone, round in the way that stones worn by great purposes are round, heavy without the tradition specifying its weight, because some heaviness is not measured in units. Resting at the base of the slope where it had come to rest, waiting in the particular stillness of things that have nowhere else to be, Sisyphus stood at the base of the slope beside the stone. Above him, in the upper world, the water still ran through the channels cut from the rock at Ephyra, and the light that sometimes appeared briefly on the moving surface had appeared again, and gone, and left the water carrying nothing but itself forward through the stone in the manner it had been carrying it since the bargain was struck, and the city was built, and the spring was opened, and the long sequence of events had run through to here. Sisyphus placed his hands against the stone. Tartarus held other inhabitants beside him. The tradition, in its various accounts of the lower world, describes the region of punishment not as a single slope or a single stone, but as a place of corresponding silences, each one occupied by its particular figure, each one governed by the logic of what that figure had been. The slope where Sisyphus worked was not isolated. It existed within a wider geography of consequence, and the other condemned souls were not far in the way that distance operates in the lower world, which is to say that they were both present and entirely separated, each sealed within the architecture of their own sentence. The tradition names them. Tantalus stood in still water that reached his chin. Above him, branches hung low with fruit, figs and pears and pomegranates. The accounts vary on the specific fruit, as if the tradition understood that the important element was not the particular variety but the weight of it, the visible abundance suspended at the precise height of almost possible. When Tantalus reached upward, the branches lifted. When he bent toward the water, it receded. The accounts note this without elaboration. The geometry of the arrangement was its own explanation. Tantalus had been a king. This the tradition establishes as part of the context rather than the mitigating circumstance. He had been invited to dine among the gods, which was itself a distinction, and had returned that invitation in the most catastrophic form, the tradition records, offering the gods a meal composed of what should never have been offered. The gods had recognized the contents of the meal, all but one, and the one who had not recognized it, Demeter. Deep in the grief that the tradition says had clouded her attention at that time, had consumed a portion before the others understood what Tantalus had done. The water and the fruit were not simply a deprivation. They were the form his particular transgression had taken, answered in kind. He had made a meal of what should not have been consumed. Now what could be consumed remained perpetually unconsumed. The relationship between appetite and arrival, between the reaching and the having, had been fixed in its most extended form and left there. Ixion occupied a different geography. The tradition describes the wheel in various ways, iron in some accounts, fire in others, the accounts not agreeing on the material because what mattered was the motion. The wheel turned without stopping. Ixion was bound to it. The nature of the rotation meant that he experienced every position in sequence, every orientation of his body relative to the ground and the air of Tartarus, and none of them was rest. His crime had a different quality from those of Tantalus or Sisyphus. He had been the first mortal to shed the blood of a kinsman, which the tradition marks as a particular rupture in the fabric of things. The first time the bond that organized human relationship was violated rather than simply strained. He had also, in a later transgression that the tradition records as the one that brought him before the gods, reached toward what was divine in the manner of appetite mistaken for entitlement. Zeus had offered him hospitality, and Ixion had mistaken the offer for an invitation to claim what was Zeus's. The wheel was the answer to his particular character. A man who had violated rest by his actions was given a sentence without rest. A man who had pursued what moved beyond his reach was set in permanent motion toward nothing. The Danaïdes worked at a greater distance from the slope where Sisyphus bent to his stone. The tradition places them in a region of Tartarus, where they carry water in vessels that the accounts describe variously as sieves or jars with open bottoms, and the water pours through before it can be collected, and the source is always present. And the vessel is always being filled, and the water is always leaving before the vessel can be carried anywhere. There were 49 of them. The tradition records the full number as 50 daughters of Danaz, and 49 of them had killed their husbands on their wedding night, acting on their father's instruction, and the instruction had been given out of a particular fear, and the fear had been generated by an oracle. And the oracle had proven accurate in the way that oracles always prove accurate in the tradition, which is not necessarily in the way the listener expected. One daughter, Hypermestra, had not obeyed the instruction. She had allowed her husband Lynceus to live, and the tradition gives her a different fate from her sisters. The 49 who had obeyed stood in Tartarus with their vessels, filling them and watching them empty. Filling and watching, with the source always available and the arrival never completed. The tradition finds in these arrangements a coherence that the accounts articulate without pressing too hard on the explanation. The punishments of Tartarus require no annotation because the logic is structural. The figure is given the form of their transgression extended into permanence. What they pursued, or what they violated, or what they refused, is now the material of their endless labour, and the labour has no horizon. This coherence extended to the wider geography of the lower world. Tartarus was not, the tradition notes in some accounts, the whole of the underworld. It was the deepest region, the part reserved for those whose offences against the divine order had been of the most deliberate kind. The meadows of Elysium lay in another direction entirely, a place the tradition describes with a quietness that suggests contentment rather than joy, where the heroes and the just inhabited a kind of extended afternoon that the accounts render as pale gold and slow wind, and the presence of memory without its grief. The asphodel fields lay between, where the common dead wandered in a condition the tradition calls neither punishment nor reward, but simply existence, after the particular urgency of living has been removed. They walked in the fields and recognized one another, and forgot in the way that things are forgotten when the pressure that makes forgetting remarkable is no longer present. The rivers organized the space. The Styx, which the tradition describes as a boundary that even the gods swore by, the most binding oath available in the cosmology. The Lethe, whose waters brought forgetting to those who drank from them, and whose banks held those about to begin again. The Mnemosyne, whose waters the tradition recommends to those who do not wish to forget, who wish to carry what they were through to whatever comes next. The new shades arrived at the bank of the Styx and waited for the ferryman. And the ferryman required the coin that the burial rites placed beneath the tongue, and those who arrived without the coin waited at the bank until their account was resolved. Sisyphus had arrived without a coin the first time. He had arranged for this deliberately. The tradition has been careful to establish this as calculation rather than circumstance. He had a coin now. Both times he had crossed, properly provisioned, the second crossing managed by Hermes, who the tradition notes does not repeat assignments. The crossing had happened. The arrival had happened. The judgment had happened. And now the slope was the whole of the world, the tradition assigned to him. The other condemned souls continued their work in the wider darkness of Tartarus. The fruit rose from the reaching fingers of Tantalus in the precise slow way that the tradition describes, as if the branches anticipated the reach and responded to it before it could complete. The wheel carried Ixion through its rotations. The Danaïdes poured water into openings that released it before the vessel could be moved. Each figure occupied their sentence in the particular silence of those who have passed beyond the possibility of appeal. And on the slope Sisyphus had placed his hands against a stone. The stone's surface was worn in the way the tradition suggests without specifying, a smoothness that implied prior contact. Prior labour, as if the stone had arrived at the base of this slope with a history that predated him, or as if the stone was simply what stone becomes when handled long enough that the handling leaves its record on the surface. He had not yet begun the ascent. The tradition leaves the first moment of the first push undescribed. It is one of the silences the accounts preserve by not filling, the way a careful narrator understands that some beginnings are more complete for being withheld. What the tradition offers is the before, and then the during, and then the return to the beginning, which is not a beginning in the ordinary sense, but something the tradition had to develop new language to describe. The air of Tartarus did not move. It had the stillness of a place where weather had never been, because weather required open sky, and the sky above Tartarus, if sky was the right word, was the ceiling of what the tradition called the underworld, and it did not change or respond. The air there simply was, the way certain things in myth are simply their nature, without variation or event. Sisyphus stood with his hands against the stone in that still air, on that slope, in that darkness that was not the darkness of distance, but of principle. Above him, in the world where the tradition says his spring still ran, the water moved through its channels cut from the high rock, carrying nothing forward but itself, and the cold and the faint sound of motion through stone, and the light that touched the water briefly and was carried on, not arriving anywhere, simply continuing in the manner of water through channels built to hold it, on and on through the rock of the Acrocorinth above the two seas. The stone did not resist him in the way that an opponent resists. It had no intention in that direction. It was simply heavy, and heaviness is a different kind of opposition, the opposition of mass rather than will, indifferent to whether the pushing succeeded or failed. Sisyphus pushed. The first movement of the stone up the slope was small. The tradition does not describe it as dramatic. A few inches, perhaps, the stone shifting from its resting position against the earth, breaking the particular adhesion that stillness creates between a heavy thing and the surface beneath it. A faint sound, stone against stone, the sound of the slope itself registering the beginning of the labour. His feet found their purchase in the rock. The slope was not smooth. The tradition suggests this without stating it directly, through the quality of the accounts, the way they describe his movement upward as something that requires the whole of his attention and his strength together, which means the footing demanded consideration, each step chosen rather than simply taken. Here a ridge in the stone that offered grip. There a section of worn surface that required the foot to be placed sideways to hold. He had learned the slope. This was one of the two new facts the tradition's silence contains, one of the things the accounts imply by not describing it each time, as if for the first time. He knew where the footing was reliable and where it was not. He knew the angle of each section of the ascent, where the grade increased and where it briefly levelled before rising again toward the crest. He knew the stone's weight distribution, where to position his hands for maximum leverage, where the surface offered the best contact. None of this made the task easier. Knowledge of a thing and ease with a thing are different, and the tradition was precise about this. He knew the slope entirely, and the slope remained what it was, steep and long and indifferent to what he knew about it. But his knowledge had become part of how he moved, integrated into the labour in the way that long practice integrates, so that the decisions happened in the body rather than in the pause before movement. The phlegethon's light moved across the stone as he pushed. This was the second new element the tradition's geometry produced here, the way the river's fire cast its low illumination at an angle across the slope, so that the shadow of the boulder moved with the boulder, a dark shape travelling up the incline just ahead of the stone itself, as if leading it, as if the shadow arrived at each new position a moment before the stone arrived, the stone following its own shadow up the hill. He did not watch the shadow. His attention was directed downward, toward his hands on the stone, toward his feet on the slope, toward the next few inches of ground he needed to cover. The other condemned souls continued their sentences in the wider dark. He was aware of them in the peripheral way. One is aware of the other inhabitants of a shared space, not through sight, but through presence. The sense of other things existing alongside one's own existence. Tantalus and his branches and his water. Ixion on his wheel, the sound of the rotation, a faint regular cadence in the deep air, the Danaides with their vessels, the sound of water falling through stone, a soft continuous note beneath everything else. He did not think of them with anything the tradition might call feeling. They were simply there. He was here. The grade steepened as he entered the middle section of the slope. This was where the labour concentrated. His shoulders bore the weight of the stone's tendency to slide back against his hands, and the muscles along his back engaged in the particular way of muscles asked to hold a position while simultaneously moving, bracing and extending at once. His breath found a rhythm that matched the pace of his steps, slow and deep. The exhalation timed to the push, the inhalation timed to the brief instant when the foot was moving and the push was held in reserve. The tradition speaks of this labour without pity, not with cruelty, but simply as the tradition speaks of what is, which is to say directly, without the softening that would imply the accounting was incomplete. This was the sentence. The sentence was the labour. The labour had this quality and no other. He was not thinking of Corinth. The tradition does not suggest he spent the ascent in memory of the upper world, turning over the images of the spring and the two seas and Merope's face in the late light. That would have made the sentence something other than what it was. The sentence was precisely the absence of elsewhere, the reduction of the world to this slope and this stone and this motion repeated. The upper third of the slope had its own character. The stone's weight here seemed to increase, which was a quality of the geometry rather than of the stone itself. The angle demanding that more of the boulder's mass be borne directly, less distributed along the slope, his arms locked against the surface. His legs drove from below, each step pressed hard into the rock. The crest came into clarity here. The top of the slope, the place where the angle of the hill ran out and became, briefly, flat. The tradition describes this moment not as hope precisely, but as the experience of proximity to completion. Which is different, the body's recognition that the distance between itself and the end of the task has narrowed to something measurable in steps rather than in lengths of slope. 10 steps. 8. The stone moved with him, following the drive of his hands. 5 steps. The crest was visible, that line where the slope met the air above it. 3 steps. His hands were flat against the worn surface of the boulder. Both palms pressed hard against the stone. The knuckles whitened the firelight from the phlegathon below. The stone was at the height of his chest. He was bent nearly horizontal against it, driving with the whole length of his body, every muscle involved. 2 steps. 1. The tradition is silent here. 2. In the same careful way it was silent at the beginning. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened here did not require description to be understood by anyone who had followed the account to this point. The stone's surface was cool against his palms. The crest was close enough that the air above the slope was present, the slight change in the pressure of the air when the confined angle of the hillside opens into the space above it. He stood for a moment, with the stone nearly at the summit, his hands holding the full weight of it. The shadow of the boulder on the slope below was stretched long in the firelight. The slope descended in both directions from where he stood, the way a ridge appears when you have climbed to its top, the world opening on both sides. He held the stone. The stone, its surface carrying the smooth record of all its prior handlings, waited with him. The tradition does not describe what passed through Sisyphus in this moment. It preserves the moment instead as a kind of balance point, the place in the labour where everything that came before and everything that would come after were equally present, equally weighty, equally his. Below, the asphodel shades moved through their pale fields in their condition of settled forgetting, far above the region where the slope waited. The spring on the Acro-Corinth carried its cold water through the channel cut from rock, running on without destination, without the need for one, simply continuing in its nature as water through stone. His hands were on the boulder. The stone was almost at the top. The stone moved past the crest. This is what the tradition records next. Not a prolonged pause, not a moment of triumph or of grief, but a simple continuation of the force already present in his hands. The stone crossed the line where the slope met the flat summit, and for the span of 3 or 4 steps the angle of the hill had run out entirely, and the stone rolled forward on the level ground. His hands were still against it. Then the ground ended. The far side of the summit was not flat. It was the same slope, descending. The tradition does not explain this as a cruelty added to the sentence, nor as a feature, the judges of the dead designed with particular malice. It was simply the nature of the hill. It had a near side and a far side. The crest was not a destination, but a midpoint. The stone found the far grade and moved. Sisyphus felt the change before he understood it. Under his palms, the stone that had required the whole force of his body to maintain its position began instead to press forward. Not the slow, grudging forward of his effort, but the forward of its own weight finding a slope to obey. His hands left the surface. They had to. A man cannot hold a boulder once gravity has chosen its direction. The stone descended. The accounts are plain about what followed. There was no sound. The tradition marks as noteworthy, no great crash or thunder of rolling rock, though the stone did roll. It found the slope and gathered in it the familiar motion, the particular rotation of a large round object on uneven ground, sometimes bouncing slightly where the rock beneath was uneven, sometimes sliding when the grade offered a smooth passage. It descended past the upper third, where the angle was steepest and the footing most uncertain. It descended through the middle section. It reached the lower slope and the long traverse of easier ground where a man might almost rest his weight and breathe without effort. And at the base of the hill it stopped. The tradition does not say it always stopped in exactly the same place, nor does it say it always stopped in a different one. The accounts preserve the fact of the stopping without particular attention to the location, which is the tradition's way of noting that the location did not matter. Sisyphus stood at the summit. He looked down. Below, the slope extended to its base. And at the base the stone rested as it had rested before, in one or another of its prior beginnings, in the dark between the Phlegethon's light and the outer edges of the asphodel plain. The firelight caught the boulder's upper surface and returned it as a pale orange curve. He did not stand long. The tradition does not describe a descent made in despair. It does not describe any quality of mood that might soften or intensify the accounting. It records that he descended, that the descent was a different motion from the ascent, the body moving differently on a downward grade, the knees absorbing the weight, the slope released. The pace quicker than the pushing pace, the arms unnecessary and hanging slightly from the shoulders. He knew the footing on this side as well as he knew it on the other. The stones beneath his feet were familiar in their placement. The place where the rock surface dropped a half step and required a slight extension of the lead leg. The place where a long diagonal crack ran across the slope and offered, if one stepped correctly, a secure edge. He had learned these on previous descents. How many descents the tradition does not number. It is not the kind of accounting the tradition concerns itself with. He reached the base of the slope. The boulder was in front of him. Its surface was cool, as it had been at the summit, as it was at every stage of the labour. The firelight from the Phlegethon moved across it in the same low angle, casting the same shallow relief across the worn surface, the faint hollows where the stone was slightly softer and had taken over the duration of the sentence, the faint impression of repeated contact. His hands found their position against the lower curve of the stone. From somewhere to one side, at the distance the tradition does not specify precisely, the wheel of Ixion continued its rotation. The sound of it came and went as the wheel completed its turns, a steady interval that had its own quality of repetition. Different in nature from the labour of the slope, but recognizable as belonging to the same order of things. The Danaïdes poured their water. The sound of it was softer than the wheel, a continuous note rather than a repeated one. The sound of water finding its way through the stone of the vessels and falling to the ground below, absorbed or simply lost. Tantalus was elsewhere in the dark. The branches were beyond reach. The water receded, each in their condition. Sisyphus set his weight into his hands. The stone resisted. It always did at the beginning, when the inertia of its resting position had to be overcome before the motion could begin. This was the first quality of the labour, the quality of the start, before any ascent had been established, before the body had found its rhythm and the stone had found its willingness to move. If that word applies to stone, he pressed. The stone shifted. Slightly, barely perceptibly, it tilted toward the slope. Then it moved, and the motion once begun continued in its way, and he walked behind it, his hands maintaining their contact with the stone as the grade increased and the pressure increased, and the long process of the ascent resumed its character. The firelight settled over the slope. Below, the asphodel shades moved through their pale fields, unhurried, without direction, in the condition the tradition names as settled forgetting. They did not look toward the slope. They were absorbed in nothing, which is its own kind of absorption. The accounts note this without comment, as they note most things in this region. Sisyphus was on the lower slope. His breath had found its initial rhythm, the longer and easier breath of the beginning of the labour, before the middle section where the shoulders bore the concentrated weight. The stone moved with him. The slope rose. The tale that later voices would carry from mouth to mouth, from one generation of telling to the next, does not number the repetitions as has been noted, but it records something the accounts do not embellish. It records that the labour did not diminish him, and it also does not say it sustained him. It simply records that the labour continued, and that he continued within it, and that the nature of the sentence was not something separate from the man who served it, but was, in the way the tradition understands such things, entirely bound to him. He had been the most cunning of mortals. He had chained Thanatos. He had persuaded Persephone. He had walked back into sunlight when no man was meant to. All of that was now behind him, as far behind as the Acrocorinth and the sound of Perrine running through its cut channel. What was present was the stone and the slope, and the long grade rising through the firelight toward a crest he had reached before and would reach again, and the certainty that the reaching was not the end of anything. The lower section passed beneath his feet. The middle section began. The middle section had its own quality, distinct from the lower slope in the way that each part of the labour was distinct. The grade steepened here. The shoulders came forward. The weight of the stone transferred differently through the arms and into the back, and the breath, which had been longer and easier on the lower traverse, shortened to match the increased demand. Sisyphus pressed. The stone moved. The firelight from the phlegathon lay across the slope at its low angle, finding the worn surface of the boulder, finding the shallow hollows in it, the places where the stone had given slightly under the long duration of repeated contact. The pale orange of the light moved across these without comment. He had known this section of the climb since the beginning of the sentence. He knew where the footing was reliable and where it required adjustment. He knew the place on the middle slope where a cluster of smaller stones had been worked loose by the passage of the boulder and now lay to one side, cleared from the path. Whether he had cleared them himself, or whether the path had arranged itself over time through the labour, the tradition does not say. The tradition records that the path was known to him. That is sufficient. The shoulders bore the weight as the middle section demanded. His breath was steady. The stone moved. It was at this point in the labour, on a particular ascent, that the later accounts do not number or date, that a shade came to the edge of the slope and stopped. The shade stood at the margin where the slope began, at the border between the flat ground below and the rising grade. He did not step onto the slope. He stood at its edge and looked upward. The accounts that carry this particular detail vary in their framing. Some say the shade had arrived recently among the dead, and had not yet completed the passage through the asphodel plane to wherever his particular shade would eventually come to rest. Others say he was pausing on a journey through this region of the underworld, a journey undertaken with a purpose the living world had set him, and that he had come to this place as part of that passage. His name, in the accounts that carry it, was Odysseus. He was the son of Laertes. He was the lord of Ithaca. He was a man the tradition of mortal Greece remembered for cunning and endurance, and the long difficulty of his returns. He had come to this place among the dead, not because he had died, but because the path he was walking required that he pass through it. He had descended with a purpose. He would ascend again. He stood at the edge of the slope and looked upward at the figure pressing the stone along the grade. The tradition does not record whether Sisyphus looked downward toward the shade who watched. The labour does not require that Sisyphus attend to observers. The stone requires attendance. The slope requires attendance. What happens at the margin of the slope is beyond the boundary of the labour, but Odysseus stood and looked. He had seen other condemned figures in this passage through the lower underworld. He had seen Tantalus. He had seen Tychos. He had seen Ixion, though the accounts differ on the order. He had observed their conditions with the eyes of a man who was still alive in a place where everything else had stopped, and he had understood what he saw in the way that the living understand such things. Through the body's knowledge of what labour costs, he watched Sisyphus on the middle slope. The stone was a pale round weight against the grade. The man behind it was bent at the proper angle for the middle section, the angle the middle section required. The arms were extended. The shoulders carried what the shoulders must carry in that section. The breath, at this distance, was not audible, but the motion of the chest could be observed, the rhythm of exertion. Odysseus, who had sailed difficult seas and endured long separations, and had been known among mortal men for the same quality the tradition names in Sisyphus, the quality of cunning, of the mind that turns even in difficulty, stood at the edge of the slope and observed. What passed in him, the tradition is careful not to say. The tradition does not embellish the inner conditions of witnesses. It records that he stood there. It records that he watched. It records that the labour of the slope continued while he watched. The stone reached the upper third. This section was the steepest. The footing here was the least certain. The angle required the most concentrated effort. Sisyphus had been in this section many times before. His feet found the footing that was reliable. The stone pressed back against his hands with the full authority of the grade. He pressed. The crest was above. Odysseus, at the base of the slope, did not move. He remained at the margin where the flat ground ended. The asphodel shades moved in the distance behind him, unhurried, without direction, indifferent to the slope and to the man who stood watching it. The wheel of Ixion continued its rotation at whatever distance the tradition does not precisely name. The Danaïdes poured their water. The sounds of this region continued in their separate qualities. The stone reached the crest. For a moment it was on the flat. The pressure through the hands shifted. The body adjusted, as the body adjusts at the crest, to the brief neutrality of level ground. Then the far side. The stone moved forward, beyond the point of balance, beyond the place where Sisyphus's hands could hold it, and it rolled. The sound of it carried back across the slope. The sound of stone moving over stone, descending through the upper third, through the middle section, through the lower traverse, until it came to rest somewhere at the base on the far side. Odysseus heard the sound. He did not move from the margin of the slope. Sisyphus came back over the crest. He descended the near side, his knees absorbing the grade, his arms hanging slightly from the shoulders as they did on the descent. He passed the upper third. He passed the middle section. He passed the lower slope. He reached the base. He came around the base of the hill to where the stone had come to rest. He passed, at some point in this circuit, within the range of where Odysseus stood. The accounts that record this moment do not record whether the two men spoke. They record the presence of both figures in this location. They record that Odysseus observed the complete cycle of the labour, the ascent, the crest, the departure of the stone, the descent, the return to the base, in the way that a man who is still living and still calculating observes things that instruct him. Then Odysseus moved on. He continued his passage through the underworld toward the point where his purpose would be fulfilled and the return path would open. He carried with him what he had seen. He would carry it back to the living world, to the ships and the sea wind and the long passage home to Ithaca, and in the years that followed he would speak of it, and others would carry his speaking forward, and the image of the slope and the stone would pass from telling to telling until it arrived here at this narration. Held now between the teller and whoever has come to hear. At the base of the slope, Sisyphus set his hands against the lower curve of the stone. The stone resisted, as it always does at the beginning. He pressed. It shifted. The motion, once begun, continued in its way. The firelight from the phlegethon settled across the slope. The lower section stretched ahead. The middle section waited above it. The upper third waited above that. The crest waited above the upper third, not as a destination, but as a point the labour passes through. The stone moved. Sisyphus moved with it. The slope rose before him, familiar in its grade, known in its footing, unchanged in its demand. This is how the tale comes to its resting place. The story ends. The silence returns. This story ends, but others begin. Subscribing means you never have to search when you need rest. The slope remains. The stone remains. And somewhere in the underworld, where the phlegethon cast its low firelight across worn stone, the faint hollows in the boulder hold the shape of hands that have been there a very long time.